Alright, it's time for us to start taking out this piece of CSS from our main plugin class. There are two things that I don't like about this specific piece of CSS in our class. The first is that it is actually sitting in our class. I like CSS to be in a separate file. The reason for that is because it looks a lot cleaner. It's a static resource, so it can be cached by your browser. And if you are concerned about having an extra HTTP request, there are ways to minify and bundle those CSS files. But since this is in the back end of our WordPress admin panel, I'm not going to be too worried about that right now. The second is this trick that they pulled to structure their CSS so that it also looks good for right to left languages. I think there is a better way to do this, and it doesn't involve getting a value based on a PHP function like the default Hello Dolly function does here. We're going to make use of a couple things that WordPress comes with by default, and the first one is WP-enqueue style. That's a global function in WordPress, and it basically allows us to add a CSS file to a generated page. You can use the WP register style function first before you enqueue it, but you don't really have to do that. The second function is actually its body underscore class, and the admin panel uses this by default, and your front end of your theme should use it as well, because it sets a couple body classes by default, and the one that we are going to be looking at is a little bit further down this page. It says text direction. If text direction is set to right to left, then it will add the RTL class. Finally, we're going to need the plugin dir URL function to determine what the path is to our plugin file. We're going to use that URL to determine where the new static CSS file is that we are going to be using in our plugin. So let's take care of these things one by one. And we're going to start by taking care of this body class. Keep in mind that if the text direction is set to right to left, then the class will be added to the body of the HTML. So here, as you can see, the plugin is still active. Now let's jump into our code. I'm going to remove this line, because we're not going to be using PHP anymore to figure out what kind of positioning that we need. So now I'm just going to add a new selector to the CSS. Whenever there is a body with a class of RTL, I would like the dolly div to get a float to the left, and I want padding on the left to be 15 pixels, and I want padding on the right to be 0. Now we are getting this error here because obviously the X variable is no longer set. By default, we're going to have this dolly element float to the right and have it padding on the right of 15 pixels. As you can see, PHP Storm is highlighting it again, but there are no more errors. Now we've taken care of splitting up that variable. It's now basically two selectors in CSS, and we no longer need that PHP function to determine what the positioning should be like. Now when we go back to our admin panel, as you can see, it still works. Now, going back to my editor, what I want to do is take this piece of code and snip it out. Now, we'll be making a new directory here called assets, and in there I'm going to be making a new file which is called improved dolly.css, and we're going to be putting the CSS that we just snipped out of the class and be putting it here. Now we can now clean up this code a little bit more, because we're not going to be using this anymore, and this action can go as well. Now, as you probably expect, when we refresh this page, it looks a bit weird now because we're not loading the CSS anymore. Since we have it in a separate file now, we need to load the CSS file on this page, and we have seen the WP and Q style function. When we scroll down a little bit, you can see that it actually it has a couple examples in the WordPress codex. We're going to be using a different hook though, as the WP and Q scripts hook is only called in the front end of your WordPress install, and we want to be using it in the administration panels. Now, back to our code. I'm going to be adding it to our improved dolly class for now, but we can also do that in a separate class. The action is admin enq scripts, and we are going to be setting the callback to a new function inside this class. So when we make that class, we give it the same name, and now we can actually use the WP enq, whoops, not script, we want style. And as you can see, PHP Storm is now telling me what I should be doing. It highlights the parameters, and if you're not using an editor that does this for you, then you can go back to the codex and you can see all the parameters here. So no worries if you're using a different editor. Now let's go back here, trigger the autocomplete once again, and the handle is more or less a unique identifier for your file. So we're going to name it improved dolly. Now, next one is the source of the style sheet. We're going to be needing a direct URL to that file that we just created inside the assets folder. So in order to do that, and I'm gonna close this this function call first, what we need to do is figure out a way that we can actually have a URL to this assets folder so we can load the improved dolly file. Now, when we go to this file, this is our main plugin file. It's actually the improved dolly.php file, which is in the root of our plugin. Now, I'm going to show you a little WordPress function that we already saw in the codex, which is the plugin dir URL function. I'm going to be using var_dump to show you the output of the function, and I'm going to die right behind it. So this will just show what the output is of plugin dir URL when we feed it the underscore file underscore. When we refresh this page, it will instantly hit that var_dump, and here you can see the full URI to the folder where our plugin is in. This can change. I mean, this can be a different folder if you have a custom WP content location, for example. So you can't rely on having this in your WP content/plugins folder, as that can be different. Now, we want to store this URI somewhere so we can reuse it. And one of the quickest ways to do this is inside a constant. There are different ways to do this, but I like a constant for this purpose. I give it a name of improved dolly URL, and I feed it as a value the return value of the plugin dir URL function. So I can now take this constant and put it in the second parameter of our WP and Q style function call, and that will be the first part of this URL. But we also need to add improved dolly.css behind it. And of course, we still need to add the assets folder in front of it, because that's where the CSS file is positioned in our directory structure. Now, when we refresh this page, you'll see that the styling gets applied correctly again. So that means that our file is being loaded. When we look at the source of this page, and when we search for our improved dolly identifier, you'll see that it gets loaded in the header like any other CSS file. This makes the code a lot more readable. We have the dolly CSS file, which doesn't no longer need the separate RTL PHP function to pick up the positioning and correctly set the padding. We can just use the admin and Q scripts action, put a callback on it, and then use the WP and Q style function to load our CSS file. This loading of the CSS can arguably be put in a separate class as well, as we don't want to violate the single responsibility principle. But we'll look at structuring this plugin differently in a future lesson.